Welcome into the first ever edition of the Buckeye 20 show here on 11 Warriors YouTube channel, as our Buckeye 20 preseason edition was released on Monday, ranking Ohio State's 20 best players entering the 2024 season. We'll be updating the ranking over the course of a season for a year-round ranking of Ohio State's best players. I have collaborated with about 9 of our 11 Warriors staffers to put together these rankings, and 2 of them have joined me here today to break down the rankings. Andy Anders and Chase Brown, 2 of our great beat writers here at 11 Warriors. Going to break down these rankings. And Andy, I know you made the comment to me when you submitted your ballot, and it's true. It was hard to just pick 20 guys for this ranking because this team is so loaded.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of guys that there's just so much talent throughout this roster, and it made putting this kind of list together really difficult and really tough to leave some guys out. But, I think what we came out with here is a pretty balanced representation of who will be the best players on this roster. And it's just nice to talk about how loaded this team is entering the season and kind of generate that excitement here, because they're going to get a chance to just put it on display with some blowouts, ideally, in these first few weeks.
Yeah, just 5 days away now from finally seeing this team on the field for the first time when the Buckeyes play Akron. One of those players who we will be seeing in scarlet and gray for the first time is Caleb Downs. And despite all of the returning talent on this team, it is Caleb Downs who came out number 1 in our preseason Buckeye 20 rankings, getting 190 out of a possible 200 points. 5 of our 10 voters ranked Caleb Downs at the top of their ballots, including both Andy and Chase. So, Chase, I'm going to go to you. Why did you put Caleb Downs number 1 on your ballot?
He just checks all the boxes. I think from the practices we've watched in preseason camp, it's pretty clear that he is just a dude. From his athleticism to the way that he impacts plays defensively, when the scrimmages we've seen, and the way that the coaches talk about him, he just seems like someone who is well prepared. And it seems like whenever the coaches compliment him, they use sort of language as he's a pro. He brings what happens in the film room and in the practice room onto the field during practice. And by all accounts, I think that he will have a great impact. Maybe not an impact that we saw last year at Alabama with 107 tackles, because ideally you would have some of the defensive line and then also the linebackers making plays before they get to Downs on the back end. But you should see him make an impact both in the run game and in the pass game. And I think Jim Knowles is going to be really excited to use him in a bunch of different ways this season.
It's hard to argue with that pick based on what we saw with Caleb Downs at Alabama last year, earning National Freshman of the Year honors. I don't think any of us have any doubt that he's going to come in and be a star player for Ohio State right away. However, I did differ on my personal ballot. I've said it several times this offseason. I believe Denzel Burke is the best player on this team, and I did put Denzel Burke number 1 on my ballot. By and large, the staff agreeing with me that Denzel Burke is one of Ohio State's best players, as he did come in number 2 in the voting. In my mind, I think nationally, I still think Denzel Burke's a little bit underrated. I think that, we know there's some really good corners in college football this year. I mean, Will Johnson, even I think most Ohio State fans would agree that the Michigan cornerback is fantastic. Benjamin Morrison, he had a great game against Ohio State when they played Notre Dame last year. He's another elite cornerback in college football. Of course, everybody knows about Travis Hunter at Colorado, the two-way star that he is. But I put Denzel Burke right up there with those guys. In my mind, I have him as the number 1 player on the team going into this year, just because of how dominant he was last year. He, in my mind, was the biggest reason why Ohio State had the number 1 pass defense in the country last season. And I think it's so easy to be excited about the shiny new toy, and you don't really get any shinier of a new toy than Caleb Downs. But I don't think Denzel Burke should be overlooked in any way as a star of this Ohio State football team for the 2024 season, and certainly plenty of agreement among our staff that he is one of Ohio State's best players on the team, though not everybody agreeing with me that he's a top 2 player on the team. Andy, looking at your ballot, you had as the number 2 player on your ballot Jack Sawyer, who did in the staff-wide rankings come out as the number 3 player in the preseason Buckeye 20. Andy, why did you have Jack Sawyer second on your ballot?
It was really tough for me to delineate behind Caleb Downs who that number 2 guy was. I definitely thought about Denzel Burke, but for me, Jack Sawyer was the best defensive player, or maybe the best player, period, on this team down the stretch of last season. What he did in the Cotton Bowl against Missouri, the huge game he had against Minnesota, one of the few defenders who really played his best against Michigan in that second half, and just overall what Jack was able to assemble in the second half of last year. To me, when you talk about this defensive line being one of the better units in the country up front, he's the cornerstone of it. And it helps, too, that he's partially responsible for returning so much talent to this roster. Now, I'm mostly thinking about who's just the best player overall when you're putting these rankings together. But, when there's so many guys kind of in that cluster, it's good to have that leadership component as something that kind of tie breaks it for Jack. And I really am excited to see what he can do this year. I've been on that Jack Sawyer truther train since early in last year. I think I got on it before some other members of our staff, were fully bought into the Jack Sawyer stocks. But that's I expect him to have a big year this year and emerge as one of the nation's best defensive ends. And I think that's reflected in my ranking.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say the staff has caught up with you on Jack Sawyer, of him coming in third in the balloting, getting 2 first-place votes from our own Jason Priestis and Ramsey Nasrallah. And so Jack Sawyer, certainly with the way he finished last year, I think erased some of the doubts that people had about him and really proved that if he can play at that level all year, he might be an All-American defensive end this season, and that's why he's coming in at number 3 on this ranking. 3 defenders to start the list. The next 2 players, though, do come on offense. TreVeyon Henderson coming in at the number 4 spot. He also received a first-place vote from our Chris Lauterbach. Certainly with TreVeyon, I think really the only question with him is, can he stay healthy? That's been the big question mark the last couple of years. If he can stay healthy, he could be the best running back in college football. This was a guy who led the Big Ten in yards from scrimmage per game last season. Such a dynamic player, both as a runner and receiver out of the backfield. And I think he's the guy right there with Emeka, Egbuka, who you really look at as the 2 established stars of this offense. Lots of other potential stars of this offense this year, but we're going to talk about as we go along in the rankings. But TreVeyon and Emeka, much like Jack, were both voted as captains of this team. I think they're really kind of the 2 foundational pieces of this offense going into the 2024 season. And Chase certainly agrees with that, because Chase, you had Emeka, Egbuka number 2 on your ballot.
I did, and I think Emeka is one of those players like TreVeyon that the question will be this season, can he stay healthy and can he return to the production that he produced as a sophomore in this offense as a number 2 wide receiver behind Marvin Harrison Jr.? I guess I'm just excited to see what Chip Kelly can do with Emeka, Egbuka in this offense. It seems that there's ways that they want to get the ball in his hands to allow him to be that explosive playmaker that he's proven to be, even since when he was a freshman returning kicks for Ohio State. They just want to get the ball in his hands. They want to get him in open space, and they want to let him go to work. And to point on TreVeyon as well, he's exactly like that. He's a guy that you want to get the ball in space. We saw whether it was the Rutgers game, the Wisconsin game, or whatever last season, TreVeyon, when he got the ball, Ryan Day's always described him as this home run hitter, and he gets the ball in space, and it's like, look out. Like, he could hit the turbos, he could hit the jets, and he could go all the way to the end zone for 60, 70, 80-yard scores. But yes, with Emeka, I think you could be seeing some similar stuff with him this season, getting the ball in his hands in space. Maybe he could pop off a few of those runs as well.
Coming in at number 6 on the rankings, Tyleik Williams, who for much of last year, I think Jack Sawyer kind of overshadowed him in the last few games of the year, but for much of last year, Tyleik Williams was Ohio State's most productive defensive lineman. I know that, numerous NFL draft analysts out there have said they think Tyleik Williams might be Ohio State's best NFL draft prospect among its senior class going into this 2024 season. And Chase, I'm going to come back to you because you had Tyleik Williams as your number 3 player on your ballot behind Caleb Downs and Emeka Egbuka.
Yeah, I don't mean to offend Andy with that pick. I think Tyleik, just for me, was someone that made quite an impact last season with more consistency, I guess, in the lineup. I think he was able to sort of unleash, if I can go to his trademark calling, he was freed. 91 was allowed to just kind of wreak havoc on opposing offenses. And I think the impact that he makes from the inside of the defensive line also allows the linebackers to thrive, whether that's going to be Cody Simon and Sonny Styles this season, or a mixture of Cody Simon and CJ Hicks, even Arvell Reese and Gabe Powers. Those guys are going to benefit from the ability that Tyleik Williams has to clog up space or just to get into the backfield and cause disruption. And I think that multi-level impact that Tyleik Williams has is something that I haven't seen from other defensive players in the front seven and in that defensive line room.
Not many 327-pound guys that move like that, for sure. So, not to cut you off, Dan, but yeah. I think just I had Tyleik 6th, which is where he ended up, and it's just I certainly see no issue with ranking him 3rd. You're not offending me with that selection there, Chase. 327 pounds, 5 PBUs, and 10 tackles for loss. Not a common combination.
Yeah, the reality is when you kind of look at the balloting, there was a pretty clear top 8 group that separated themselves from the others in terms of how many voting points they got. It was Caleb Downs, Denzel Burke, Jack Sawyer, TreVeyon Henderson, Emeka Egbuka, Tyleik Williams, and then Quinshon Judkins coming in at number 7, JT Tuimoloau coming in at number 8. There was a 30-point gap from JT Tuimoloau at number 8, going back to number 9. And so I think there was a pretty clear consensus among our staff that those 8 players are Ohio State's biggest stars going into the 2024 season. Now, I think it's interesting a little bit to look at the dynamic there of where Quinshon and JT are ranked, because I think if you look nationally, I think there's a lot of people who think Quinshon Judkins is Ohio State's best running back and that JT Tuimoloau is Ohio State's best defensive end. Yet we as a staff collectively agreed that TreVeyon Henderson is Ohio State's best running back and that Jack Sawyer is Ohio State's best defensive end. Looking at the ballots that our staffers submitted, I think Garrick Hodge was the only member of our staff who ranked Quinshon Judkins ahead of TreVeyon Henderson. And I think looking at JT versus Jack, if I'm doing this math correctly quickly, I think Kyle Jones was the only member of our staff who put JT Tuimoloau ahead of Jack Sawyer. So it's a little bit interesting to kind of see that dichotomy there between, those of us who cover the team on an everyday basis and people who are looking at it from a national perspective. And I think that's probably particularly notable when it comes to TreVeyon versus Quinshon, because with TreVeyon, we've all seen TreVeyon do special things for the last 3 years. We've, maybe watched some games, watched some highlights of what Quinshon Judkins has done for the past 2 years, but we haven't actually watched him play on an every game basis like we have with TreVeyon. And so, it's going to be an interesting dynamic, I think, with both of those positions to see how that kind of plays out over the course of a year, who emerges as Ohio State's best running back and who emerges as Ohio State's best defensive end. But I think we'd all agree that both of those players at both of those positions are outstanding players, wouldn't we, Andy?
Oh, yeah. And ranking Jack ahead of JT or TreVeyon ahead of Quinshon, and I had TreVeyon and Quinshon 7-8 right next to each other in my ballot. It's no slight against either guy. It's just Ohio State is stacked at both positions. And I think where I'm interested to see Quinshon is exactly how they deploy him, because I feel like he might be a more consistent chunk runner, like sort of those 6 to 8 yard pops at a defense, whereas TreVeyon's more of your home run threat. I think they have kind of complementary styles in that way. So I'll be interested to see how they split up carries, who ends up getting more production as the year goes on. And both, Quinshon's per carry statistics dipped last year. TreVeyon's had some injury history, as we know, and that obviously really hurt him in his second year, held him out of some games last year. So both of those guys definitely also have things in their past that they can iron out and be more consistent this season. But exactly that's a ballot that could very well change as the year goes on. It wouldn't shock me if Quinshon Judkins ends up being the more productive of the two, or if TreVeyon Henderson ends up being the more productive of the two. And I think both are going to put up some really good numbers.
I made the comment earlier that you can't have much of a shinier new toy than Caleb Downs, but you could argue that maybe the next guy on this list is even shinier, because Jeremiah Smith has gotten, I think, as much hype as any Ohio State freshman has ever gotten going into his freshman year at Ohio State. And that's why, even on a team full of veteran stars, he is ranked as the number 9 player in our Buckeye 20. And at first glance, that feels like it should be like a little bit like bold or controversial, that like we're putting a guy who's never played a college snap in the top 10 on a team that's this loaded. And yet it really doesn't like feel out of place at all. All three of us actually ranked Jeremiah exactly 10th on our ballots, but I think putting him in 9th, it does not feel out of place at all. It would be tough to put him ahead of any of those first 8 players that we talked about because of how proven they are. But I think we could probably all sit here and say it's probably more likely that Jeremiah is going to move up these rankings than he's going to move down them, because everything we have seen this spring has been just phenomenal, and everything we've heard about Jeremiah this spring has been phenomenal. And so I'll go to you, Chase. I mean, with Jeremiah being 9th, would you agree that where he's ranked is just right?
Absolutely. And I think you're spot on in saying that it's more likely that he goes up this list than to go down. When you look at Jeremiah Smith and his performance this spring and in preseason camp, you said it earlier, Dan, you think Denzel Burke is one of the best cornerbacks in America. I think we would all agree that Davison and Igbinosun is also very talented, let alone Jordan Hancock, which I know those guys are going to be maybe a little bit lower on this list. We'll talk about them, but Ohio State's defensive backs are among the best in America, and Jeremiah Smith outperforms them. I can't say consistently because we don't get to see every single practice, but there are highlight moments where you watch him going at Denzel Burke, where you watch him going at Davison and Igbinosun, and even with the talent that they have in the depth in that position room, Jeremiah Smith is going toe-to-toe with them. I also think, too, and this is, I don't mean to cast lofty expectations on Jeremiah Smith, but I was looking at these numbers the other day, and I'd be curious what you guys think about it. Did you know that Michael Jenkins is Ohio State's all-time leading receiver in terms of yards? And he has 2,746 yards in his career. If Jeremiah Smith is to play as much as we think he's going to play this season, and then continues to stay healthy in year 2 and year 3, there's no reason why he doesn't end his career, though it could even be 3 years, as Ohio State's all-time leading receiver. The touchdown numbers are a little bit more lofty. You have 35 with Chris Olave. That's a little bit more lofty, but the yards, especially, Jeremiah Smith could end his career as Ohio State's all-time leading receiver. I don't think that's something that's unattainable for him and someone of his talent.
That sounds like a great 11 Warriors poll question right there. Andy, I have a feeling based on what you've said about Jeremiah, you would take the over on that.
Yeah, I'm on record several times on Real Pod Wednesday saying Jeremiah is going to be at 1,000 yards this year. I think he's going to be the true number 2 guy behind Emeka, and he's just way too talented and way too polished coming out of high school. What he's shown in preseason camp, There's clearly a plan for him to start and have a major role in the offense already. And what we've seen, I think he's really going to achieve things we've never seen from a freshman receiver at Ohio State, and already has. I mean, Iron Buckeye, earliest black stripe removal ever. The staff has done nothing to sort of quash the hype about Jeremiah with some of those selections in the offseason and saying, hey, this guy has not only got talent like you've never seen at receiver, he's got preparation and dedication and workmanship with his craft better than any receiver we've had coming in. So this is this just feels like a coronation year for Jeremiah as only a freshman. And I certainly think he's more likely to move up this list than down.
The next three players in the Buckeye 20 are all defensive backs. Jordan Hancock comes in at the number 10 spot. Lathan Ransom comes in at the number 11 spot. And Davison Igbinosun comes in at number 12. And another pretty big gap after that group until we get to the next group of players on the list, which I think speaks to just how good this secondary is going to be this year. You're talking the number 1 and number 2 players on the team, plus 3 of the other top 12. I mean, this is a secondary that is absolutely loaded. And I think, all 5 guys in that secondary have a real case for being among the nation's very best at their respective positions. Would you agree, Chase?
I would agree. And let me put a pin in that real quick. I just want to mention, so that people don't come at me in the comments, Emeka Egbuka is very close. It probably should surpass Michael Jenkins in terms of all-time receiving yards this season. He only needs like 800 or 900 more yards. But no matter what Emeka Egbuka gets, I just want to say, I still think Jeremiah Smith could surpass that number when it's all said and done. Going back to the defensive backs, I totally agree. I think that each of those guys are in position to have ginormous years for Ohio State, especially with the way that each of them have a chip on their shoulder, it seems. Lathan Ransom was talking the other day when we had him after a preseason practice, talking about how he feels, I guess, a little bit underrated coming in this year because of Ohio State's addition of Caleb Downs, that, he's excited to work with Caleb Downs, but I think that he may feel a little bit as an afterthought in that back end of the defense. And he's someone that, when you look at Ohio State's defensive scheme and the way that it operated before and after his injury last season, it changed. Sonny Styles had to move around. You had guys like Jordan Hancock playing more consistently. I think the way that he can impact in his leadership, especially on the back end of that defense, is worth considering when you look at his standing here in the Buckeye 20.
The next 3 players on the list all received exactly 61 voting points, which tells you how close it was. Davison Igbinosun at number 12 received 93. The next 3 guys all received 61. So that shows you there was a gap between those top 12 and everyone else, but then it was very close. The next 5 players on the list actually all separated by only 5 points. We'll start with the 3 players who were tied at 61 points each. Carnell Tate getting the tiebreaker on the 13th spot because he was the only one of these 3 players that was ranked on everybody's ballot. Donovan Jackson and Cody Simon both ranked on a majority of ballots, but not every ballot, with Donovan Jackson by virtue of getting 2 11th place votes, while Cody Simon was not higher than 12th on any individual ballot. Donovan Jackson gets the tiebreaker for the 14th spot. Cody Simon coming in at number 15. We'll start with Carnell Tate here. This is another guy. A lot of guys here we've talked about where they're kind of proven commodities. Carnell Tate is not. But much like with Jeremiah Smith, we've heard a lot of good things about Carnell Tate dating back to last year. Andy, I know that you recently wrote about Carnell. What are your expectations for Carnell Tate this season?
The expectations, I think, are shaded by how many good receivers are around him, right? So I'm not going to put any yard markers on it like I've been stamping the 1,000-yard thing with Jeremiah, but I do expect him to emerge as a star and he expects to emerge as a star this year. It's clear when you talk to him, he's got that sort of quiet confidence that a lot of great receivers are built out of, that I think we heard out of Marvin Harrison Jr. the 3 years he was here. Very different players on the field, but I think that sort of mentality and that self-assurance that, quietly, hey, yeah, I'm going to get this done. I'm going to be this guy. Brian Hartline, he said he has maybe the toughest hands on Ohio State's team. And when you watch him in practice, his catch radius is really good. And I think that's going to be something that stands out about him this year. Ability to snag a ball that's maybe over his head or reach behind him and make a nice play. But he's also really athletic, and they're going to move him around the offense a little bit, I think, too, which is something that Emeka obviously has the ability to do as well. But they can play Carnell in the slot. They can play Carnell outside, where I think he'll be primarily. But I do expect big things from Carnell Tate. The other guy, tied in that grouping that I had, I think, higher than some others, I had Donovan Jackson 12th on my ballot. And it disappoints me when you say, Carnell's the only one that's tied here that wasn't on every ballot. I think that Donovan Jackson should clearly be one of the 20 best players on this team. Yes, he had his hiccups last year, had some lapses. Obviously, the play against Michigan, but this is at his best one of the best offensive guards in the country, and he's got to do that on a more consistent basis this season. I'm not going to deny that at all. He's going to have to do it game in and game out, and it's going to be really important for this offensive line to have him doing it game in and game out. But he had games last year where he did look like an All-American, and I think he's definitely capable of playing to that level. And all around, I would put him highest among Ohio State's offensive linemen, and did on my Buckeye 20, obviously.
All right, Chase, I got to give you an opportunity to defend yourself now, because you were one of the two that did not include Donovan Jackson on your ballot. What went into that reasoning?
I'll be honest. I don't even know. I messaged Dan when I made my bracket, and I think maybe some of the staff members had a similar approach. Was I kind of just went with vibes. I kind of was just like, all right, I'm just going to throw Jeremiah Smith on there because he's looked good. I'm going to make Caleb Downs my number one player because he's looked great. I'm going to take Will Howard somewhere in the 10 to 20 range because he's impressed me as his quarterback performance. I think with Donovan Jackson, maybe it's just the offensive line. It's hard for me to rate them when it comes to the best 20 because you don't really get verifiable numbers or quantifiable data that you can look at for how they perform. Really, I go off the Pro Football Focus grades that they receive. And I think with Donovan Jackson, you're exactly right, Andy. There's the consistency thing there that I think he can deliver this season. I think he will benefit from having an experienced center next to him in Seth McLaughlin. And I think Josh Simmons' development at the left tackle position could provide some more stability on that left side, to where I will definitely make sure to have Donovan Jackson on my next iteration of the Buckeye 20.
Yeah, I think Donovan really ultimately came out about where he should be. I had him 13th on my personal ballot, and so I think him being kind of in that 13 to 15 grouping, I think that's about where he should be, and I think that was pretty much the consensus from our staff. Now, I do think he's a guy that could move up the rankings as the year goes along, because this is a guy, I think if he puts it all together, he can be an All-American left guard. I mean, he has that kind of talent. I think we would all agree he did not consistently play to that level last year, yet he still got first team All Big Ten honors. And so I think the offensive line, to Chase's point, it's a unit that tends to get kind of graded as a group rather more than an individual a lot of times, because it's such a unit-based position. It's so based on, all five parts have to be working together for that unit to succeed. And so I think in some ways, Donovan maybe gets hurt by the fact that, because the offensive line as a whole struggled last year, that reflected poorly on Donovan, and maybe he gets knocked down a little bit further than he should be. But, I think the reality is the reason why there's no offensive lineman higher than 14th on this list is because the offensive line was not good last year. And so the offensive line goes into this season with a lot to prove. Donovan is not immune to that, but he does still come in as the highest ranked offensive lineman on the list at number 14. Now, interestingly, Andy, you did not have Cody Simon on your list, as Cody Simon comes in at number 15. And I think, I think Cody's an interesting guy on this list, because I think he is not as flashy as any of the 14 guys we have already discussed before him. Yet, you just hear the way everybody on the team talks about him. The fact that he got the block O, the fact that he was named a captain. This is somebody who the team has a lot of trust in. And it is my opinion that in the last 5-6 games or so of last season, that Cody Simon was Ohio State's best linebacker. Now, some of that was because of the fact that Tommy Eichenberg was injured. But I think down the stretch of last season, I think Cody Simon was Ohio State's best linebacker. And I think, he is Ohio State's best linebacker. As much excitement as there is for some of the other talent in the room, I think he is going to be the leader of this defense this year. And so I think 15th is a very fair place to rank him because of all the stars that he has around him on this team. But I do like him being in that top 15. Andy, why did you end up omitting him from your ballot?
Yeah, I can't argue with the 15th placement. And full disclosure, I submitted my ballot before the Block O came out, and you find out he was the single top vote getter to be a captain and all these things. But I think for me it was there's just a lot of guys on this team that are super talented and that I have a lot of respect for, and that Cody did it in the second half of last season. I do think there's some sneaky pass coverage things that he needs to work on and develop a little bit heading into this year. Against the run, he's the best they have, I think, point blank period. And will hopefully, some of those and he's going to be the backbone of the defense. So not a guy that I'm low on per se. I'm just like higher on some other guys, I think. He could very well work his way into my top 20 by the next time we do this. I think he'll probably make me look stupid in the first handful of weeks of the season and go out there and ball, and I'll have him well within the top 20 next time.
Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people who have been listening for the last 31 minutes and are going, where's Will Howard? Well, here's Will Howard. Will Howard is ranked as the number 16 player on the Buckeye 20 going into the 2024 season. And if you're asking why is Will Howard so low, well, hand raised. Now it's my turn to defend my pick because I did not include Will Howard in my top 20. And truthfully, my reasoning for that is very similar to these guys. It's hard to pick only 20 players on this team. This team is so talented that it's hard to pick only 20 guys. And there was enough uncertainty around Will Howard based on what we saw in the spring that I felt like there were 20 other players I should put on my ballot over Will Howard. Will Howard would have been my 21st player. So I'm not sitting here saying I think Will Howard is going to be bad. I think if Will Howard is what I expect him to be, it's very likely he will be in my ballot next time around. But I wanted to kind of take a wait and see approach with Will Howard because of the fact that we did see that unevenness in the spring. I still, while I think we have seen a lot of good things in preseason camp, I'm not quite there yet on him being a star quarterback. I think he can be good enough for this team, but I think a lot of that is going to be being able to take advantage of the weapons that he has around him, some of whom we've already mentioned here. Now, certainly not surprising for a quarterback. I think one of the more polarizing players in terms of a balloting on this list. He was ranked as high as I think 8th on one ballot. Andy, I believe you had him 13th on your ballot. You had a lot of the same concerns that I did about Will coming out of spring. So what sold you to move him up to 13th on your ballot coming out of preseason camp?
I think everything that isn't talking about his deep ball accuracy. And, that's a component of his game that even if it doesn't get to, the consistency, completing somewhere around 50% of your deep throws, that sort of thing, the offense can still succeed without that component. But what we've heard about him as a leader, taking command of the huddle, what we saw with him in those handful of practices we got to watch, and just the accuracy he has all around the field, kind of 20 yards and under, and really good, snappy decision maker. The rushing threat is huge. And I think ultimately he separated from the rest of the quarterbacks for a reason. And there are some good quarterbacks in Ohio State's quarterback room. So for me, I think what we saw in preseason camp is what ultimately vaulted my opinion of him upward. And if he proves to be a guy who can stretch defenses deep, and that it's not only going to be a huge dividend for Ohio State's offense, because I think that vertical stretch is something that can always like impact your ability to move the ball. But it'll also catapult him up, I guess, everyone's ballots even further, I'd imagine.
Another player who I think is firmly in the camp of guys who could rise in the Buckeye 20 this season is Sonny Styles, who starts the year out 17th on the Buckeye 20. And, that has a lot to do with the fact that he's playing a brand new position. He was a safety last year. Now he's a linebacker. So he has to prove himself at this new position. But his upside to be a star at that will linebacker position is very high. I mean, you're talking about a guy who was ranked in the top 20 of Bruce Feldman's freaks list for a reason. This guy is he runs like a safety, but he's 6'4", 235 pounds. And based on everything we've seen this preseason, he has looked like a very natural linebacker. And so I don't dispute the ranking of him being 17th just based on the fact that he's going to play a new position that he's not unproven at. Yet I won't be surprised if that ultimately proves to be too low over the course of a season. Chase, I believe you had him 13th on your ballot. So what were the vibes you were getting on Sonny Styles to rank him where you did?
I just think his athleticism intrigues me more than anything else. I think this comparison Andy will like, probably you too, Dan. For him playing safety last season, it was kind of like a wrestler on Ohio State's wrestling team going below their weight. He had to keep himself at a weight to maintain his speed, to maintain some of that athleticism, to cover opposing wide receivers. Not that now he can let loose and not pay attention to his nutrition and his weightlifting at all, but he's a little bit more free to, eat some more food here and there, to lift some more weights here and there. And I think now you're going to see maybe even a more athletic version of Sonny Styles, or I guess maybe the more natural fit to his athleticism at the linebacker position, to where he can be someone that can impact the game in multiple ways. Andy mentioned earlier that Cody Simon is an excellent defender against the run. I think Sonny Styles can contribute in that way, but then he also has the versatility to cover some of the offenses, maybe their bigger tight ends, maybe some of their sizier, their bigger slot receivers. I think the ways that Jim Knowles will use him, and Jim Knowles has said as well that he has lots of success bringing safeties down closer to the line of scrimmage in his history of being a defensive coordinator. I think now you're going to see Jim Knowles really unlock a version of Sonny Styles that we haven't seen yet in his time at Ohio State.
The Buckeye 20 for the preseason is rounded out by a trio of big men in the trenches. Josh Simmons coming in at 18 on this list. Ty Hamilton coming in at 19th on the preseason Buckeye 20. And Seth McLaughlin edging out Josh Fryer on a ballot tiebreaker for the final spot in the Buckeye 20 as he comes in at number 20. I think Josh Simmons is interesting because when we did our pre-spring Buckeye 20, Josh Simmons did not make the top 20, yet now he comes in at number 18. I think that speaks to some of the good things we've been hearing about Josh Simmons coming into this season. Just the growth that he seems to be making, paired with the upside he has. I mean, this is another guy you talk about freaky athletes. This is a guy who's widely considered to be the most athletic offensive lineman on the team. Had some issues of penalties, some inconsistency last year. But if he can put it all together, this is another guy who has the potential to really make a big move up the rankings as the year progresses. Would you agree with that, Andy?
I would, and we've seen it some in preseason camp. He's looked pretty good in pass rush one-on-ones against some of the elite defensive ends Ohio State has. I really thought he took a lot of strides last year down the stretch. He made my ballot personally, I think right at 20th, if memory serves. But I had him right at 20th. But he's a guy that, again, that upside is there to where he can climb quickly and emerge as even like a day 2 NFL draft pick is kind of what you feel he could become with the right season this year. And if that happens, and Donovan Jackson finds his consistency, this left side could actually be a strength for Ohio State on the offensive line. And what a turnaround that would be from last year if that proved to be the case.
I do think Ty Hamilton's a guy who's maybe slightly underrated here, and I think we'd probably all agree with that because we all had him either 16th or 17th on our ballots. I think this kind of goes right in tandem with Larry Johnson calling him a sleeping giant. I think, again, you talk about flashier players on the team. He's not in that group, but I think he's a guy who can be a really good nose tackle for this Ohio State defense this year. And so that's another guy that I won't be surprised if he gradually moves his way up the list over the course of the year. If he can have that kind of breakout fifth-year senior season, much like his older brother Devon Hamilton did as a Buckeye. Seth McLaughlin, another guy too, where I think for me, I left him off my ballot personally because of the snapping issues that we saw him have last year at Alabama. I think that uncertainty. He's, again, a guy, he would have been 22nd or 23rd on my ballot. He was right there in that conversation, but I didn't quite feel comfortable enough with him yet to put him in the top 20, but he certainly has the capability to move up the rankings and be a really good center for Ohio State as long as those snapping issues prove to be a thing of the past. Now I want to go around the room here and talk about who are the guys who are not in the preseason Buckeye 20 that either should be or you think will be by the time this season is over? Chase, I'll start with you. Who's one guy who jumps out to you in that regard?
I would probably say the wide receiver we didn't mention being Brandon Inniss. The way that Ohio State has talked about him, it's a similar archetype or a similar model to Emeka Egbuka. Chip Kelly's going to use him in these ways where they're going to try and get him the ball and try and get him in space. He has a history as a running back. He has a history as a wide receiver. He has a history probably even as a quarterback. This guy's just a one-of-a-kind athlete, like so many people on Ohio State's roster, that I can envision him having an early season surge, maybe just something that puts him on the map of Ohio State fans. Now watching these early games against Akron, against Western Michigan, against Marshall, where a lot of depth is going to play. So, he might not be that top three receiver in terms of the starting lineup with Emeka and Jeremiah and Carnell, but you're going to see him get a lot of reps. And I think with those reps, he'll do good things.
All three of us had Brandon Inniss on our ballot. So if it had been just us three making the rankings, he would have been in the Buckeye 20. Andy, I think you had Brandon Inniss 15th. So you certainly agree with him being a snub here.
Yeah. And that was, I believe, probably the top guy on my list that didn't make the top 20. I'm really high on what Brandon can accomplish this year, not just in the offense. He's such a dynamic weapon and very explosive in space, very shifty. Kind of reminds me of Garrett Wilson in some of those regards, what he can do out of the slot. But as a returner, I think he's going to turn some heads this year. Get that. He said he wants a punt return touchdown, and I wouldn't put it past him to get one. He's a very dynamic player in space. And for me, like Chase, I think probably the number one player left off of the Buckeye 20 that I would have put on it.
The other guy for me, the guy who was actually highest on my ballot that did not make the Buckeye 20 was Jermaine Mathews Jr. Because I've said it before, I think Jermaine Mathews Jr. would be starting for any other team in college football. I think if Jermaine Mathews Jr. had a path to the starting lineup, he'd be a guy that he might be a top 10 player on this list by the end of the year. I think he's that good. I think, for both of those guys, really, the only reason those guys aren't in the top 20 is because of how loaded their position groups are. Most likely neither one of those guys are going to be starting for Ohio State this year. But again, they would start pretty much anywhere else in the country. And I think that's especially true for Jermaine Mathews Jr. I understand why he didn't make this list because we don't know how much he's going to play this year just because he has Denzel Burke and Davison Igbinosun and Jordan Hancock in front of him. But I think you feel very good about if, you don't want to lose any of those top three guys to an injury because they're all so good. But if any of them do have to miss time, I think you feel very good about having Jermaine Mathews as a guy who can step up and play at that spot, much like you would at wide receiver with Brandon Inniss. Just looking at our balloting, there were 5 total players who received votes who did not make the Buckeye 20. As you mentioned, Josh Fryer, he actually tied with Seth McLaughlin for voting points. So he was the first man left out, followed by Brandon Inniss, then Jermaine Mathews Jr., and then receiving 1 vote each were CJ Hicks and Caden Curry. Chase, you had CJ Hicks at number 20 on your ballot.
I did. I had him behind Cody Simon and Sonny Styles, and I think for me, it's all about CJ Hicks's potential. And I feel like we've kind of been talking about his potential for a few years now, and I don't mean to put an ultimatum on his ability, but I do think that there is sort of this narrative building around him, like, if not now, when? If this is the opportunity for him to seize control of reps, to seize control of snaps and opportunities to rack up tackles for loss, as he said in his press conference earlier this preseason, rack up those sacks, rack up those tackles. Ohio State fans have been waiting a long time because he's kind of just been, I guess, not as far as a household name, but I think a lot of Ohio State fans know who he is because in his recruiting class, he was the leader. He was the one that was bringing everybody else along. He was the one, he's from Ohio. He's an Ohio kid. All these things built up to this reputation that he hasn't quite met yet. And I think that there is some intrigue to him just in terms of what production he can have this season as maybe a third linebacker behind Simon and Styles.
Well, it's going to be really fascinating to see how these rankings develop over the course of a year. I think if this team lives up to expectations, it's not going to get any easier. It's only going to get harder to pick only 20 players to make these rankings going forward, because there could be guys we didn't even mention who, have breakout years, end up having bigger roles than expected. It always happens every year. There's always a guy who, you're not talking about a ton in the preseason, and then he ends up making a big impact for the team. And so, we'll see, who does that guy end up being? Is that guy in the next edition of the Buckeye 20, which will come out mid-season? We'll get through that first half of the season, get through that big Oregon game in the middle of October, and then that second bye week. We will be back with another edition of the Buckeye 20, ranking Ohio State's 20 best players through the first half of the season. And so we appreciate you all joining us for the first edition of the Buckeye 20 show. We hope you enjoyed it, and make sure you stay tuned with 11warriors.com for much more coverage of Ohio State football as the Buckeyes 2024 season gets underway this week.